So for your system, we have that double circulatory system we were talking about. We're going to look at a number of different components to this system that you need to consider. One is the superior vena cava, or we abbreviate it SVC. This is going to return blood from the head and arms, and it's going to return it to the right atrium. We have the inferior vena cava. If superior is the top parts, where do you think inferior is returning things from? Return blood from the legs and the lower parts of your body. And again, returning to the right atrium. I don't care where it's coming from. If it's deoxygenated blood that needs to be pumped through, it's going to return to the right atrium, always. From here, it goes to the right ventricle and then out to the pulmonary artery. Artery is a way, remember? So this is going to send blood from the heart to the lungs, and in particular from the right ventricle to the lungs. We come back from the lungs through the pulmonary vein. Vein is back to the heart. So this is lungs to the heart, and in particular to the left atrium of the heart. From there, we go to the left ventricle and then out to the rest of the body. It's going to leave the heart through something known as the aorta. This is the largest blood vessel in your body. You should be able to trace a drop of blood from anywhere in your body through this major pathway into the right atrium, into the right ventricle, out through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, pulmonary veins returning to the left atrium, the left ventricle, then through the aorta and out to the rest of the body. Your heart itself is pumping all of this blood, and when we look at its efficiency, we look at cardiac output. So this is the volume of blood pumped per minute from the ventricles. This goes along then with heart rate to figure out how much blood you're actually pumping. So the heart rate, as you know, I think, is beats per minute, or BPM is your heart rate. So if we have BPM, your heart rate, beats per minute, and we know how much volume per minute we have, we can actually figure out how much blood you're pumping per beat if you want. And this is interesting to consider based on different conditions. So are you under a lot of stress? Are you doing physical activity? Do you have a heart defect that might cause differences in these volumes? All things to consider physiologically. This is just a different diagram of the heart showing you the same pathways coming in to the right atrium from the body, using the right ventricle to go to the lungs, the left atrium coming in from the lungs, and then the left ventricle going to the body. And in particular, remember, via the aorta. So the actual cycle itself of the heart is controlled rhythmically. We want your atria to contract, then your ventricle. Atria, ventricle. It does us no good if your heart starts going haywire and we go atria, 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 ventricle, atria, atria, ventricle. No, we need a very rhythmic, repetitive motion to this. And some of you may know that your blood pressure is based on two terms, diastole and systole. And diastole measures the blood flow from your vein to the heart chambers. So that was the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava returning to the right atrium. So that's what that measures. And the systole is measuring from your atria to the ventricles. So within your heart, atria, atria, ventricle, ventricle. So it's actually measuring the pump at the top. So the squeeze or the pump of the atria itself. This shows you on a time scale how fast this is happening and where all the valves are opening and closing in the heart. I'm not concerned about this for what we're learning right now, but I know some of you might be interested in it. The SA node, or the sinoatrial node, actually looks at how we regulate the contraction of the heart itself. So the SA node actually is going to generate electrical signals in the atria to determine how fast the heart beats. Now, this is based on a lot of things, including information from your brain about how much carbon dioxide is in your blood and so on. The AV node, so the atria-ventricle node, or the AV node, sends these signals to the ventricles, so the ventricles will then contract. So it's an entire checks and balances system to make sure that your heart is beating when it's supposed to. And if you actually have an ECG, or many of you know this is an EKG, it's an electrocardiogram. K if you are in England, C if you are in the US. We see the beating, and if you can follow this through, the yellow indicates what's actually going on. The EKG shows you the electrical activity associated with it. So you see a little spike here when the atria contract, and then over here you see a giant spike when the ventricles contract. And this process happens over and over and over again to make sure that your heart is staying in rhythm and that everything is beating properly. Going along with this, of course, we have valves to make sure that the blood keeps going in the same direction. These are one-way valves that are only going to allow blood to go in that forward direction, as we talked about, in the direction that we outlined, and prevents backflow into our chambers or into our body itself. So we have what we call semilunar valves that are associated with the veins and the aortic arch here. The aortic arch is this thing that is actually arch-shaped. And then the semilunar valve associated with this would be the pulmonary artery. The cuspid valves are associated with the connections between the atria and the ventricles. So these are AV valves. Some of you know them as. And that's fine. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail more about the valves themselves, but I want you to know that they're there and they help us regulate blood flow and make sure it goes in the same direction. But what you actually hear when you listen to your heartbeat is not the contraction of the ventricles. It's the sound of the valves closing between the atria and the ventricle, so those AV valves, and then the valves closing between the ventricles and the arteries themselves, so actually looking at the semilunar valves. If the valves get damaged, so this could be valve damage from genetics or from some sort of disease. If they get damaged, you may develop something known as a murmur. And that heart murmur is actually when some of the blood flows from the ventricles back up into the atria, so the valves don't stop that backflow. And the murmur you hear is the fluttering of the valves as the blood moves back into the atria. This decreases, of course, efficiency of blood flow and efficiency of exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide.